Welcome to the adventures of self. Conversations with ordinary and extraordinary people as they explore what it means to be self-expressed. Come on in. Join the adventure.
So welcome, Ben Corkery, to the Adventures of Self.
Thanks so much for having me on, Taylor. Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, cool. So let's get into symbolism. I just feel like we can sort of spend a few moments like setting the waters, or let's just choose. Well, here we are at the big end of the swimming pool. So let's just dive in to symbolism. And I think we were talking before the show about like an understanding that there is symbolism in our lives, but it doesn't necessarily, we don't have to fix down what a symbol means at any particular moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I like that. And I mean, as a fan of a lot of older stories where symbolism was, really rich, and not that we've totally lost that, but I think it's something that we maybe identify more easily in older stories. I think on the one hand, we kind of sometimes need to look back to those, stories that whether it was something as a kid, something like the Lord of the Rings, people love that story, and the symbolism is very clear when you get into, different creatures, different characters, and kind of that more maybe, medieval age. So it's something that's very present still, and I think can be very kind of helpful and meaningful for us today. But sometimes for me, I look back to kind of remember how to do that, and then I can, use that again.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things, we came together sort of randomly, as often podcast hosts and guests do, but it's always nice to sort of see the things that align us. And we were just speaking before, we both studied literature at university, and so the idea of story and symbolism is, I don't know if it comes naturally to us, but we have a connection to it. There's something meaningful to me about the symbolism of something, and I'm always kind of interested to understand, even an occurrence in my life, like if I drop a cup of coffee on myself, like what's the symbolism underneath that? I mean, you can spend a little too much time dissecting everything, but there is, but I think it goes to who we are as humans. I mean, this idea of telling stories and having symbols of the very, very essence of language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, 100%. And the way that I think about that is really it's meaning making. Really, I think however we explain it, why these kind of stories are wired into us, we don't really know why we, anyone responds to a story. And the perfect example is a kid or a child who, brings you a book to read them the story. And it's like, you don't teach them that really. They just pick up on that. And, so I'm not sure where, that innate desire that's built into us comes from, but I think meaning making becomes a very big thing. Like you mentioned, just even, whether it's something small going wrong, like your coffee spilling, or something bigger, like a car accident or whatever that might be, a personal crisis. I think it's our way of starting to make sense of things and yeah, kind of contextualizing ourselves in our own life story.
Yeah, and that sense of making meaning, because we live in a complex world, and seemingly increasingly so at every second or moment. We're kind of adding complexity to our lives, and yet there is this deep desire, goes to like Viktor Frankl's, man's search for meaning, and you could look at countless philosophers, spiritual traditions, all over that are trying to kind of answer this maybe unanswerable question, but to get a sense of this, and the idea around meaning and meaning making may not be so much the destination of kind of like, oh, I've solved for X and now the answer is 42, like from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But that it's the process of just going through that meaning making search and understanding, and as you say, contextualization, and of course the context changes. So what you were yesterday is different from today and tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I'm reminded of this quote, and I don't know exactly where it's from, so I can't credit it, but it's something to the extent of the answer is in the walking, and there's a Latin term for that, but it kind of speaks to what you said there about not necessarily just solving for X, but yeah, this answer is in the walking, which is the moving forward, which is the progression of the story. So that's kind of, I think, yeah, another way to think about that. That it's in the unfolding, and it's in the process, I guess, which might seem obvious, but it's definitely something I think we need to learn again and again.
Well, that sense of walking, I don't know how much of an outdoor person you are, but I mean, I really appreciate, we're so busy in things. I mean, I live in London, and usually I'm cycling everywhere to get someplace, but people are on tubes and transports or driving, and we're in this, got to get from A to B, and there's a tradition in rural England, and there are people, we do go out for hikes, but this sense of kind of like going out ambling and kind of out for a walk just for the sake of it, we're quite distant from that for most of us. And yet, from my experience, when I've done that, it really opens up quite different space, like time and space, right? The slowness of walking, and whether I'm choosing to go somewhere specific or I'm just out, for that sort of ambling, things start to occur. And there is something, I mean, Socrates, famously would have these sort of walking meditations and kind of go out with his students. And there's something in the pace, the rhythm of how we walk that puts things into a different perspective. I mean, there are all these famous, stories of engineers and scientists who sit at their desks and labs and everything and try to, solve for X or whatever complicated equations they're trying to solve, and cannot get the answer. And yet, when they go out for a walk with the dog, when they take the shower, when they're in a different state, a more relaxed state, the answer comes to them.
Yeah. And that's reminding me, I'm not sure if you're familiar with The Artist's Way, Julia Cameron's book, but anyways, I've worked through that before, and I'm just working through it again. And I was reminded again of that process of, the movement, and whether it's walking or even driving for some people. In the book, references Steven Spielberg, saying he gets his best ideas when he's driving on the freeway, and he's kind of merging in and out of, weaving along. And yeah, there's definitely something to that movement, and that, it can transition you out of that, maybe stagnant period or thing that you might be stuck in, and just get changing perspective. Maybe it's changing perspective, maybe it's rhythm, but that movement really seems to have kind of a magic to it.
Well, there definitely is a sense of flow, right? I mean, so whether it's driving or walking, and I do that, like if I go for a long distance cycle ride, I'm in the sort of rhythm of just sort of turning the pedals, and I've got to obviously be fairly cognizant of cars or pedestrians or wherever I am, of other things, but it puts me into a state, and cycling's an interesting one, because I mean, I know some long distance runners have this as well, but I'm not much of a runner. But cycling you can do for hours. I mean, I literally go out for 3 or 4 hours, and I've obviously got to be mindful of what it takes. Like, Spielberg has to know that if he's going along at 60 miles an hour, you can't just sort of close his eyes and meditate for 20 minutes. And it does sort of, there is this sort of like the sense of that flow, like it takes us through life, through a landscape, through something that sort of accelerates. It can accelerate our sense of where we were and where we're going, right? Because it's literally doing that. And then, the symbolism that's from that is we can take that, from where we were to where we want to go with something.
Yeah. And that's kind of, I mean, aside from the physical, exercise being obviously a plus, or for whatever it is you're doing. Yeah. That really tangible experience of moving, of you were here and now you're here. It's just very real. An exercise that I like is, people like to set goals, and sometimes things can be so hard to gauge. They can be so far out, but there's something about setting even a very small goal. Walk down to your mailbox and touch it. Tell yourself you're going to do that, and then go do it. And right there's a win you've put on the board, because you saw that very small, thing unfold. You moved from one point to another and completed an objective. And so it's a kind of obvious, symbolism or tool, but it's pretty powerful, I think, to reflect on, or to use.
Yeah. And I think the thing about it is, because we can get caught up from, our Instagram or celebrity or, $1 million or billionaire kind of world that's presented to us, to really discredit or not acknowledge the things that we actually do on a daily, hourly, minute by minute basis. I remember one of the guests I had on, I can't remember what episode it was, Jim Shupak, had a really severe bout with depression. He really just ended up very depressed, and had about 100 days where he was just kind of catatonic almost, and kind of couldn't do anything. And what started him on his road to recovery was he was lying on the couch of his parents' basement, I think, and he was sort of an adult, one of these adults who kind of like everything falls apart. Nothing had happened. He just sort of went into this really severe depression. But the family dog, knew, or maybe just needed its needs taken care of, but would come up and sort of nuzzle him, right, to say, I need to go out. And so he literally would say, okay, I'm going to put my shoes on, I'm going to walk around the block, and did once, right? And after 2 or 3 days, he said, well, I went around the block once. Maybe if I did 2 blocks today, and kind of went from there. And he said within about a week, he decided to like leave the dog at home, and he said he was just going to go for a short jog. And he's not a very fit man. I mean, he sort of self-admits this. He's a bit portly, and he just kind of worked his way up. And about a few years or so later, he decided he was going to run a marathon, and ran his first marathon, and then decided after that, when he was sort of interviewed by local news channel or something, like, oh, what inspired you to do this? And he explained the story of his sort of 100-day ordeal of being depressed, and it sort of dawned on him. He said, I lost 100 days to my depression, and now I really want to gain that back. And my way of doing it, my symbolism for doing that, is to run 100 marathons, so one for every day that he'd lost. I thought, wow, that's quite ambitious and quite lofty. And when I'd spoken to him, I think he's done in the high teens, 15, 18. So it's not like he'd accomplished 80 or 90 of them, but a lot more than I've done. I don't run marathons. So, and it's just interesting because, like, what I loved about the story is, you get this sense, it's like from simple beginnings, right? From where you are in a very sad, depressed, challenged state, to say, I'm just going to get up, put my shoes on, and walk the dog around the block, to then deciding, after some period of time, I'm actually going to run one marathon for every day I lost to depression. And the symbolism that's rich within that, and it goes to, it's one man's journey and one man's decision, but how we deal with, we were talking about meaning, right? How do we make meaning of our lives? How do we go through this process of healing, of restoring our sense of balance, and maybe even tipping the balance, to the other side, because it's quite exaggerated, I suppose, to run a marathon for every day of you've lost to depression. It takes weeks or months to prepare for that, and yet there's something obviously beautiful, quite inspiring in that story.
Yeah, a couple things come to mind. One is in my own experiences as well, during a time when I was just experiencing some anxiety, some depression, figuring out what that was, kind of at a transition in my life in my early 20s, and almost in a similar position, not totally down and out, but not getting a whole lot done, not getting out much, not really making things happen, but then kind of deciding to, it was kind of hard to think clearly, even to make plans to do anything like that, but deciding on a walk, when you wake up, just start walking, put on your shoes and go for a walk, that's a very, it's something simple. It's something that, you can make that happen. You can go and you can walk, and then you can walk somewhere and you can walk back. And, that simple exercise, especially if, if you're someone who, whether, you wake up with anxiety or wake up, kind of dreading another day, it's just a concrete thing that can kind of ground you in a very small way, get you moving. But then the other thing, just kind of in reference to the marathons, and something I've been thinking about is kind of like what you said about flipping this. So there's this kind of, maybe something, some type of crisis or something that's occurred in your life, on the more negative side, starting to turn that over. And then, I mean, even if you start very small, realizing that, maybe you could not only kind of redeem that, so to speak, but maybe you could almost make it better that it happened because of what you did out of that idea of redemption, of coming back stronger, whatever it is. I think, it was obviously something that guy, tied into with that goal, and I'm sure will, reach other people with his story too. So I like that, how that idea of flipping it over, and then sometimes you don't know where that's going to end up taking you.
Yeah, what was interesting about his story, right? He didn't start with that. After some months, he decided to run one marathon, and it was only after completing that, and in a discussion with somebody, that the idea came, well, why don't I do this? Why don't I do 100 of these? Because, and it goes to, like I've spoken about here, how we choose to create things, and, our story or our lives or whatever. Sometimes I think people can think or assume that when they see somebody else out there, particularly in our, Instagram and social media world, where everything looks like it's polished and finished, that like, oh, well, that idea was already always there, and so so that person just followed through with it, not recognizing all the sort of messiness or crooked line essence of what it took to get to that, and maybe the failings or the wrong turns, and how that all came about. Yeah
100%. And I think I for sure, we see that in ourselves because we experience it. But like you said, you can see the result, or a certain chapter or a certain highlight of a story, and not realize, everything that was behind that, everything that went into that, the really small steps, just the walk around the block, that it started with. So yeah,
and there is this sense, that each of us, everybody has to face themselves and and ultimately choose a life that suits him or herself. But one of the other things that connects us, and maybe it's because of our interest in literature, is this idea around seeing seeing one's life as a story. And I'd kind of like to just to hear your take on this, because it's something I've been playing around with in workshops and my own sense of self and some writings, and it comes up here on the podcast as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I kind of ended up in literature, I guess, and I always enjoyed reading, and I enjoyed the stories, and the way I could kind of conceptualize that type of study, because it was never something I thought I would study, was, listen, there's these stories and they're pretty good stories, and we can extrapolate things from those that are of value for our lives. It was something that I'd always kind of done on my own. I enjoyed reading growing up, and so I almost kind of approached it as almost like this is a kind of a practical. I know a lot of people probably wouldn't think of literature as being a kind of a practical degree, but that's really how I approached it. I wasn't particularly interested in writing at the time. The more kind of technique side of it didn't appeal to me. The genres, I was more just interested in these stories, these myths, these narratives, and I thought these are tools, and I had one teacher that kind of inspired me, because a literature class which I had not been that interested in up until that point, he took these stories that I was familiar with, and then he extrapolated these these kind of narratives out of them and then apply them to our lives. And I thought that is valuable. If I could do that, then I can take something out of these stories and I can use it, essentially. Kind of a utilitarian approach, but also make them real. I mean, I think it's about making these stories real, and not only that, but realizing that that they are real, that narratives and meta narratives, archetypes, if you will, are real, and they're a powerful way of conceptualizing our world, our personal situation, where we've come from, and then where we're headed.
Yeah, and I think that goes to, why stories have come to us, and why they're part of the human journey, and have been for thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. That maybe this actually is what gives us a sense of consciousness and language, because on some level, if you imagine back, say, tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago, there was no TV, there was no sports to watch. It was just life and looking for food, shelter, safety, pretty basic things. And once sort of those are established, I was actually just writing something this morning on a post, because it came up as a quote from this week's episode of the podcast, and I was talking about sort of Maslow's, because around actualization, I was talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs as a framework. I mean, to me, it can be a little flat, but it's a useful reference. And how once you've got this sort of psychological and safety needs, you got your shelter, you got your food, and whatever, you start to expand out, right? You start to expand out in your psychological and social understanding of things. And this, we do relate to stories. I mean, if you break things down in your own life, we're always telling stories. It could be the story of how we had a bad day at work because our employer did something, our employee did something, a client, a delivery person. There are all these things that either it was amazing and we won a great contract and millions are coming into the business and isn't this amazing, or all this collapsed and because this one thing happened and it's this person's fault, or what are we going to do? And similarly, that happens in our personal relationships with family, with friends. It's all over, right? We're kind of we're always telling stories, and the so much of what occupies us is story as well, right? I mean, you were talking about Lord of the Rings, right? I mean, here's a book that was incredibly popular when it came out, and obviously did amazingly well when translated to film and everything. Film, TV, every commercial is a 30-second story, right? I mean, and we're when you read, even if you read journalism, right, as this happened, mostly, there's a story. Let's tell a story about one person and then draw it out to how this applies to society as a whole or something. So it really does go to a sense of how we as humans view ourselves, view our lives. It's the base of everything.
Yeah, and once you realize that, I think you start to see it more and more. You start to recognize it more. You can become aware of the stories that you're telling yourself, that the people around you are telling or are a part of. And then I think the next step in that, whether you do it consciously or not, is kind of identifying yourself as one of the players, and kind of looking down the road and thinking, what is my role here? Who am I? And how do I fit in here? And a neat thing to do, I think, is to look at look at the stories you like, look at the characters you like, the movies you like, your favorite movie. There's a good chance that you relate to someone in that very, very closely, even if it's a different time period, a different genre, whatever it might be. There's a good chance you're going to, one of the reasons you like that is because you relate very strongly to a character. And even that can be even more telling, once you realize, okay, there's some stories going on here, but what does that mean? And then you start to see, oh, maybe I'm that person, or am I that person, or could I become that person if I have the courage, if I have the audacity, if I have the perseverance, whatever it might be. That's when it starts to get really interesting, I think.
Yeah. And I think you and I both bring this sense. It's like, it's one thing to read and appreciate and to be entertained by a story, but then what we can do is start to weave that into, how do we create, how do we write our own story, which, is, as you say, in a way is quite an audacious concept that, and it goes to the heart of what I do as a coach, and one of the things I try to highlight here on the show is the ability to start to write your own story, and what that actually means, because you're right. I mean, we watch or we see or we read a particular story and we relate to something. There's something in our heart, in our longing, in our spirit that is called to one story, not another. And it gets to this kind of like meta understanding, and it can start to feel a little freaky, and the ground's sort of not quite as stable as we thought it was, as it opens up, and you actually become part of the story that you imagined. Because the alternative, and this is certainly how I lived for a good portion of my life. I mean, I thought I had agency. I thought I could do things. I thought I could choose to, well, I'm going to go move to this city and try to find a job and do these things or whatever it is, or I'm going to choose this other thing. But in terms of, those are kind of like more changing the setting, the milieu, the dressing of what was happening, because when we talk about the story, the narrative, it's like, well, here's an arc of the story that goes from boy meets girl, or boy moves to town, or woman starts a job, or whatever it is, to happily ever after, or whatever the arc of that story is. And to think that I have an ability to influence and maybe actually to create the whole thing.
Yeah, that it can be a pretty big realization. I think it hits everyone in different ways at different times, and in different contexts for sure, be it cultural or spiritual or whatever way you want to slice it. I think it's an important kind of point to come to, but also then, figuring out what that means. And when you kind of alluded to, you can change things and thinking you're changing it, but before you've really had that awakening of agency. Actually, just earlier this morning, I was thinking about how we often like to pull these levers or change these external things, which can, whether it be our physical location or our work, where we're at, and that can be a powerful tool, but sometimes, we do that thinking that is the change we're going to affect in ourselves. And I think it can be a bit of a kind of carrot on a string sometimes. And that's when we get into, things that we think might bring us fulfillment in our stories, and realizing it's not maybe what we kind of thought it was. And that's when things get a little deeper, but definitely it's a powerful thing to realize, and then what do you do with that? I'm sure that brought you to what you do now. It's a big question. It's a big concept.
Yeah, and it's interesting, because when we spoke before we got started, is, as you were saying, you studied literature, and that's kind of brought you to this appreciation of story. And it's interesting to hear your approach of having this very practical understanding of literature, because I did not. I mean, it's taken me a while to come to that practical understanding. I think when I studied literature, I studied film and literature at university, and primarily from that more critique or observational sense of something, and I didn't really have a sense of what I wanted to do with it. I thought I wanted to be a filmmaker. I wasn't a very good filmmaker, or I didn't have the confidence in myself at the time, and so went on to other things. And what's nice for me, what I really appreciate, turned 50 a couple of years ago, and there's this sense of coming back to the things that were important to me 20, 30 years ago. Now, there's a part of me that feels like, wow, I missed all this time. I could have been deep in this, deeper appreciation, and really being able to build up my knowledge, my expertise on this. And yet, I kind of went off wandering and meandering about, sort of that amble we were talking about earlier, where for a good couple of decades, I don't regret my decisions, but I kind of went off into the corporate world and traveled the world. And in the last, 5-7 years or so, I've really come back to the things that were important to me. Recognize it's like, wow, I really used to love myth, story, and now I've got more experience. I don't know if I've got more wisdom, but I've certainly got more experience to contextualize that and to appreciate that, and to recognize that is the something, not necessarily the only thing, but something that moves me quite substantially, and I'm quite keen to build on that, use that, those natural interests that I have for my own sake, for my own story, and to help others.
That's really neat. It's really neat to hear. That idea of kind of coming back to it, and in some ways, I'm at this, not the other end, but a challenge for a couple of years for me has been this idea of at what level do you kind of run with this idea, and how far do you take it? There's obviously, you know, practical things in our lives to take care of in terms of responsibilities and whatever level we find ourselves. But then there's also this draw to pursue what often seems maybe like the unpractical, you know, these stories of, you know, you know, my heart or my intuition is maybe saying, you know, this job's not for you. It's gonna crush you, or it's gonna not leave time for you to pursue those things. But at least it's, you know, it's safe. And I think that's maybe something we could talk about too, is that the idea of safety, because I mean, that's the other thing that's, you know, it's all well and good to talk about stories, adventures, but they're scary. They're uncertain. You know, we don't know. There's that great line in The Hobbit about, you know, Gandalf says to Bilbo, you know, Bilbo asks if he'll return. And he says, well, I can't guarantee you will return. And if you don't, you won't be the same. And it's like, well, that's kind of scary. So that's a piece of it. I mean, you know, for how I'm trying to charter things out moving forward, and for you as well. But I think it's I guess what I'm saying is it's not something that necessarily just, you know, happens on its own. And like we mentioned earlier, even for others, if you see something, you know, amazing in their life or something that they've done, there was courage there, and there was a commitment to those things they loved.
I think, yeah, I mean, you know, well, it's one of the reasons that that my podcast has the word adventure in it. And adventure is something that I really appreciate in myself, and that I seek to cultivate in others. It's taken me, you know, a while to come to that. And, you know, my business talks about adventure. You know, so if you go to my website, you know, the strap line for my business is: the adventure you seek in life is yourself. Right. And so I really believe in this self journey, and that, you know, we are seeking adventure. There is something about us that seeks to go outside of what we know. Now, obviously, there is a part of us that wants to be safe and secure. But we're in this constant tension of wanting to be safe and wanting to be just at the limit. You know, you talk about children. I remember a very good friend of mine here lives on a canal boat with his partner and their child. And when his son was quite young, sort of in the sort of 2 to 4 year old range, the boats are essentially, there's, you know, these pontoons or whatever you walk on out from the land onto these, and then each boat is kind of attached to them, and you know, there's no guardrails. I mean, it's just like you can fall in, and certainly in wintry conditions, it's, even as an adult, it's pretty easy just to slip and fall in, which some people do. And his son, you know, he got to a point where, like, he was testing what was safe and what was exciting, and would like, my friend was saying how his young son would kind of go to the edge, you know, knowing that the parents would be like, oh, be careful, you might fall in. And yet he had this, you know, sort of temptation that he wanted to test for himself. Like, not that he wanted to fall in and hurt himself, but there's this, like, where are the boundaries of what's safe and where's the adventure? And you know, certainly I mean, your generation much more so, and it's just continuing, right? You look at, you know, teens today, you know, but you know, the daredevil aspects, I mean, it's just, I mean, it's remarkable. Like, you know, I'm fascinated by, you know, like all this culture of people that have, like, are so at meeting the totality of their fear. You know, what's his name? His name just escaped me. Who, you know, Free Solo, the guy who you know, climbed up El Capitan without any pro and any ropes at all, right? And then, you know, there are these people who do, you know, skydiving with a parachute in their hand, or even don't even jump out with a parachute and hope that they fly over to somebody else and hold on to them, or and all sorts of just like, amazingly crazy stuff. And so we are sort of always at this edge. Like, yes, there's a part of us, absolutely. There's a part of our brains, right? The fight, flight, amygdala, reptilian brain that, of course, wants to be safe. And yet there's another part of us that's looking, goes to this sense of meaning, that's looking out. That's like, well, what else is there? What else can I do? Why did Columbus, and not to belittle the atrocities of what explorers did, but if you look at the basic concept of the Drakes and the Magellans and the Columbuses that said, I'm going to get in a boat and I have no idea where we're going. We may sail off the end of the earth. We may be met by wild animals, or native indigenous people in foreign lands that will kill us, or disease, or who knows what, right? And yet something drove these people to do that. And we're still doing that in all sorts of ways. So I like to think it's like, well, rather than it being either or, we have both of those. Mm-hmm. There is a part of us that absolutely wants to be safe. And there's a part of us that wants to go out and explore and test that and be on adventures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point, because it's also never a done deal. It's every day. It's every situation that we find ourselves in. Obviously there's bigger and smaller decisions and paths to take as we go along, but it's like, yeah, it's not a done deal. It's almost it's choosing to live just in that mode of being open to adventure kind of continuously, while obviously maintaining a reasonable amount of safety. But yeah, it's definitely not a done deal.
Yeah, and even because I think there is a concept, I worked in the corporate world for quite a while, and had colleagues who still do that, and there's this assumption that, like, well, if I do this, then I've kind of secured the safety, right? I've got the 9 to 5, I've got the salary, I've got the pension, I've got these things that give the illusion of not just safety, but I think security, right? Of certainty. And they're probably on balance more secure than, say, my life and job as an entrepreneur and running my own business. Mm-hmm. But there's no guarantees, right? I remember talking to people, my mother and people of her generation who, even like my grandparents' generation, where you started at a company, a General Electric, whatever. That's it. You knew you were there till 65. You knew you'd get the watch as a present for retirement, and then get your pension, and there was this contract. It's like, you give your heart and soul and everything to a company for whatever it is, 40 years, then they'll take care of you, mm-hmm. and they'll give you this at the end. And there was kind of this understood contract, and of course that's completely gone now, right? And so it's kind of, I think, drawing people to a sense of, well, what story do I want for myself?
Yep, 100%. And on that note, I after my degree, I worked for a couple of years with a startup with some friends, which we had big hopes for and didn't end up panning out. And I kind of returned to formal education again with the hopes of kind of that kind of safety. Almost, so I became a teacher here in Canada, which is it's sort of just 2 years, but it's another bachelor's degree. And here our system is very stable, and if you get in there, it's one of the few places now that you kind of you can get that that safety and that security, and a lot of people do it for that reason, the benefits and the all this and that, and do your 25 years and retire. And so I kind of went back to that, but realized pretty quickly, even during the program, as I was reading a lot and starting to realize kind of my kind of more entrepreneurial interests, and even this idea of taking a bet on yourself, kind of seeking out the adventure, I realized that I really wasn't looking to land that position in the school system to be secured down there for the next, decade or even half decade. And I also started to realize that I was kind of that idea of, securing something and then thinking I could maybe focus, on the side on more of my actual interests, which is, perfectly reasonable in a lot of cases. And a lot of people do that. But I started to realize a little backwards for me, especially in education, because here I was, wanting to teach kids to trust themselves, to pursue their interests, to build these lives. And really, I felt like a bit of a fake, because I felt like I kind of wanted to preach that, but I was kind of afraid to do that myself. And, maybe that's being hard on myself, but I really took it seriously. And I really felt that way, was that I couldn't perpetuate this by, maybe telling kids to do this or teaching them, but really saying, but yeah, you can just go be a teacher and kind of do what I did all over again. And it was neat, because I realized in the program as well, probably half the people were of the same mind. They had interests, they had these things that they wanted to explore and go after. But they either didn't know how to do it, or they that kind of divide between the security and the quotes unsecurity, which as you mentioned is kind of really shifting at this time. But I think that's something I'm exploring more now for myself, but also hopefully to help others kind of cultivate the awareness, the confidence, the courage to kind of go after these things. But I guess that brings us also to your work, and how do we start doing that? How do we start cultivating that? How do we go after that? So that's definitely questions I'm asking myself and trying to pursue. And it seems like, your content gets to the heart of that as well.
Well, I think, what comes to me, it's in the word that you said. It's cultivation. And, cultivation is when you cultivate crops, for instance, you don't just plant a seed and walk away, right? Mm-hmm. You got to look after it. Sometimes you may have to replant it. You put it from potting soil into regular soil. You give it some nutrients. You tend to it. You prune it. You give it water and light, protection in frost or with heavy winds or all these things, right? And I do a lot of work using nature as a metaphor. So it is a cultivation, very, very much like that. And I just think as well, because we were talking about story, I just kind of want to come back to that sense of the ability and the choice, I think, to write one story. I just want to share it because it comes up. I was running a workshop recently around this very topic. It's like, well, you've got a story to your life, and there are these there are myths, there are archetypes you were talking about. We haven't really gotten into much of that, but there are these kind of, archetype. The archetype is sort of the original type. I had Christina Kotori on a few weeks ago, who is a modern Greek priestess and uses ancient Greek, her understanding of ancient Greek, to really understand what it is that myth is and how we bring that into our lives. And there are these, meta symbols or ideas, myths that pervade society. Joseph Campbell famously wrote, Hero with a Thousand Faces, which talks about the hero myth that by all accounts is a almost step-by-step model of a journey, the hero's journey that has been around for thousands of years and in every civilization. Every civilization has a hero myth, and they all seem to follow basically the exact same steps. So how is that? Why is that? Well, there must be something about who we are fundamentally. It goes back to our sense of story, of what it is we're here, and how we create meaning, the journeys we're on, how we go from that sense of safety, from being in the Shire as hobbits and go off on adventures with Gandalfs, and knowing that there's no guarantee, but that we are called to adventure. And there is this sense, it's like, first, in the first instance, to choose that, to recognize, maybe even before that, is to recognize that we do have that available to us, and then to choose that. I'll just share a quick story that I use, that I came across, which I think is fascinating. Carl Jung, sort of the founder of modern psychology by most accounts, and an incredible academic and scholar and philosopher, not philosopher, but scholar and academic, and understanding of trying to put together these these myths and ideas. And it was in his 50s, I think. I saw something written about him, that he was working with a patient, and she, in her workings with him through writing or painting, because he often used painting, getting people to paint and draw what they saw in their dreams, what they imagined, and then would find the sort of myth that was in there, that people that didn't have education, classical education, that were basically recreating the same myths that were told for thousands of years. And that in her understanding and recovery of whatever incidents and challenges she was having, she was creating a myth for herself. And that was his job. That's what he did as a psychologist, as a practitioner. And yet what's fascinating is what he said was, here he was watching this woman create her own myth. And here he was in his mid 50s or something, and written dozens of books, and was already world famous at that point. And he looked and he said he didn't know by what myth he was living. And he said, and it caused him pause. He said, well, what is my myth? What is my purpose? What's the myth of my life? What am I here for? And so it took him into great introspection to say, well, yeah, great. I've created modern psychology. Yes, I've worked with thousands of people and done all these things, but who am I? What's my story? What's my myth? And it took him back to his childhood, and he recalled that as sort of a 4 or 5 year old little boy, he loved working with little blocks. He just loved like putting blocks together, and it gave him the sense of purpose, of meaning, of kind of like the little boy who's like, read me this story, mommy, daddy. And so he recognized that he had this real deep desire to build something. And he bought land, or had land, on whatever it is, Lake Geneva, and started building, literally stone by stone, block by block, a home that became, I think, the Bollingen Institute, which houses all the Jungian studies and all this. But it was this real sort of deep understanding, and it came at a very, very late point in his life, or later point in his life, not that he was. And then to start to take action on that, right? To really have that moment to say, what is it that's important to you? And then how can you start to, like we were talking about earlier, take one step around the block, put one block on the ground to start building what's important for you.
Yeah, I love that story. And that gets at the heart of, I think, what we started out with the story, and then what it ends up meaning. And as I been working on some of this stuff and trying to make sense of it myself, it's neat that you mentioned that building portion, because I think that's a huge part of it, and that that ends up tying to creativity, which I think becomes a huge kind of piece of the story as we start to move into whatever that adventure is. creativity, I think, plays a very important role there. But the way I've kind of conceptualized this is this kind of a pattern to this process that people go through, and this was more just recognizing this in myself, and it made sense to me. But also, I'm just starting to see if it can pan out. And it's kind of these four different concepts that we go through as stages, and it's like there seems to be kind of this healing or realizing this kind of this period of confronting whether it is that we're not on the path we want to be, or that we are in a story. So there's this kind of awakening, this healing portion, which then leads into this cultivation that we talked about, which is kind of, what are my talents? What is my story? Where am I going? Which then leads to this building stage, which is then the creativity portion. Then there's this building. And then the fourth one is sharing, which then both leads to kind of relationship, community, and it's kind of, out of the building, then you share, then you house, then you home, whatever it is, then you give. But then the neat thing is that also then goes back to the healing portion, because it's through that process that you heal. So it's kind of like thinking about these things, and just my own journey kind of seems to have followed those. But not only is it just a process, but it's like a refinery. It's like you continually run through that process of kind of healing, cultivating, building, and sharing, and they kind of work off each other. But that story that you just shared, I mean, that to me, that's another example of that happening. So that's really neat. And I hadn't heard that one before about Carl Jung in particular.
Yeah, I mean, and what you describe, I mean, in a loose way, it actually fits into the hero's journey. I mean, it's a little different, but I think that the confronting, right? One of the first things that happens in the hero's journey is that a child that's been in hiding, that assumes that it is, a muggle, a virtual peasant, like a mythical peasant, right? Actually realizes that it is, it's divinity. It's it's a king, right? Superman grew up, didn't realize that it was from a king from Krypton, King Arthur. All these stories. Luke Skywalker, right? They and then they're confronted with this idea. It's like, well, actually, here's who you really are, right? And in particular, that sense of community and giving back, the sharing. I really love that you've come to that, because that is the last stage of the hero's journey. And Joseph Campbell talks about this. I really was fascinated with this when I read this in Hero with 1,000 Faces, because the hero's journey is not complete until you share what you gain on your hero's journey back, right? So like at the end of I think it's The Hobbit, but they get the gold from the dragon's lair, but they don't just hoard it and say, well, this is mine. They go back to all the villages and share it with everybody who helped them along the way, right? And there's this mythical sharing out of what you've gained in your own journey, in your own hero's journey, and it's not complete. Your journey is not complete until you provide that. And Campbell gives a lot of references to this. In particular, the one that astounded me the most is that when Siddhartha, who became the Buddha, reached enlightenment, he was talking to disciples or colleagues and friends, and they said, well, you have to share this with the world. And he said, I don't know how to do that. I can't do that. How can I share this with the world? So there's this real challenge of how do we actually share what we've learned back in society? Because it's a challenge, right? It's a challenge to synthesize that, to make it relevant, to bring that back. And yet that's what ultimately completes the circle. And as you say, gets us back to the healing.
Yeah. And you see it. One thing, just different people I follow, whether it be online or people I look up to, or just see, in more of an kind of an entrepreneurial context is this big stage of building, which is awesome. But then you almost don't get a choice. You get at a certain point, you feel that pull to share, to come to the full realization of that story. So it's just another example. I think it's funny that I mentioned teaching, and it's almost, at the proper place in the story, there's almost a duty for that teaching and that sharing, which I think, more appropriately becomes after some sort of, adventure has been gone through, where, some sort of wisdom has been gained, and it's time to share. But you definitely see that happening, whether it just be through podcasts or all these different, forms of education courses that are going on now. You can see it happening, and it's just interesting to see that unfold in the broader, even economic context.
I think you're right. I was thinking earlier as we were speaking, there is this kind of like movement, right? And I think because we've gone through that, the kind of the safety and security of the IBMs and the General Electrics, or, whomever, it was like, well, here you go, you do this, and for 30, 40 years, and then you're taken care of. And that world's gone now. And so there is something rising up in all of us that's looking for how we create that. And I in my mind, like that's a natural impulse. So it's going to find its way, right? And so we've got these ideas of teaching and how we share, and you see much more. I mean, for all the breakdown of sort of traditional models and business systems, the startup communities and these and this essence of, there's much more of a ground up sense about taking care of things that really goes to this sense of looking after and creating that meaning.
Yep 100%.
Wow. Cool. Well, this has been a really, really great discussion. We've kind of like quite magically gone through an hour with very little pause, or and I think just like to bring it to, like, we're kind of back full circle, and yet the journey continues. Like, one of the things we were talking about at the beginning, that I think is like keeps this open as we close out, is this idea of unfolding, right? We kind of created something here, and there's this sense of we're trying to sort of navigate our way through our own lives, what our story is, a conversation here that we record, and an awareness, even a cultivation of things continuing to unfold.
Yeah, I mean, and I kind of mentioned it at the start, but even these conversations are that cultivation at some level, because you put pieces together, me who's looked at some of this stuff, and then from my perspective, and then you from your perspective, we put this together, and then it's kind of like, oh, okay, we start to cultivate through that, which then can unfold into the next piece of all this. So that's definitely what I'm taking away from it.
Yeah, and cultivation, it's the same root as culture, and so there's this sense. It's like, well, it's not just one person sitting there and looking after the tree or the crop, right? It's what we cultivate, right? There's a group or a communal sense to that, and in that, we bring learning, we bring new understanding, and the conversations that you and I will create individually and maybe collectively from this have this. We've tended the soil here, and the roots that we put in for the seeds we plant tomorrow have that nutrient in it from even this 1 hour.
Yeah, I feel that.
Cool, Ben. Well, this has been a rip-roaring discussion and a lively adventure of words and and possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, awesome to hear your take on that and bringing the kind of the experience from your side of things to it, to kind of yeah, just put that together and like we said, coming to these realizations, but then also thinking about what's coming next. How is it continuing to unfold, and what story are we choosing to write with our next chapter, or even our next page, or even our next sentence, as we were talking about starting small. Nothing wrong with that.
Well, I mean, every story, every trip starts with one foot in front of the other, and every story starts with one word followed by another. Cool. Thanks, Ben. I really appreciate your time today. And we'll see you somewhere down the road in some other story as our paths cross over, the stories overlap. I always like it when you see the like now you've got all these like Marvel and DC universes, and you got one movie that's very much about one character and another movie about another character, and then you see like they overlap a bit, and you see them from a different perspective. It's like, oh, that's what that character did at that time. So the stories continue to overlap, and as you say, we cultivate ourselves that way.
Yeah, well, Taylor, thanks so much for having me on. It's been a great discussion. I always love delving into these things and cultivating them, as you were saying. And I definitely look forward to seeing what happens down the road as our own stories unfold, and I look forward to following along with your content and journey. But thanks so much for having me on.
Great. Thanks, Ben.